They don't knock at Millhaven Home for Children. That was the first thing I noticed. Every adult who ever came through those doors, social workers, inspectors, church volunteers with their baskets of scratchy donated sweaters, they all just walked in as if our privacy was a courtesy they hadn't been asked to extend. So when I heard the knock, 2 slow, deliberate raps on the dormitory door, I sat up from my bunk and felt something shift in the air. Something was different. It was a Tuesday in late October 1961. I was 17 years old, and I had been at Millhaven since I was 8. Since the winter my grandfather brought me there himself, sitting rigid in the back seat of a county car, his big hands folded in his lap like he was praying. He hadn't looked at me when they took my suitcase. He hadn't looked at me at all. I'd spent 9 years being angry about that. 9 years building a wall out of that anger, brick by brick, until it was the sturdiest thing about me. The woman who knocked was named Mrs. Aldridge. She was the administrative secretary at a law firm in Dunbar, West Virginia. A small woman in a brown wool coat, sensible shoes, and a hat that had seen better decades. She carried a leather satchel and an expression of careful neutrality, the kind people wear when they are delivering news they cannot predict. "Nora Voss," she said, scanning the row of girls who had stopped pretending to read and were watching openly. "Here," I said. She looked at me, really looked, the way most adults at Millhaven had learned not to, and said, "Mr. Calloway sends his regrets that he couldn't come himself. He asked me to bring you these." She set the satchel on the foot of my bunk, unclasped it with neat efficiency, and produced 3 items. The first was a letter, sealed with a wax impression of a mountain. The second was an envelope of money, which she said was from my grandfather's estate, $160, the entirety of what was left after debts and burial costs. The third was not a key. Every girl in the room was staring. Millhaven girls had a 6th sense for inheritance. We'd been told our whole lives we had nothing coming. Anything that arrived from the outside world carried the weight of a miracle or a joke, and we'd learned to expect the joke. "Isn't there supposed to be a key?" said Darlene Marsh from 3 bunks over. Darlene always said the thing no one else would. "For a house or something?" Mrs. Aldridge folded her hands. Mr. Voss left his granddaughter a parcel of land, 12 acres in the Gauley River Hollow, along with a structure on the property. She paused. "But the bequest comes with a condition. There is no key." She reached back into the satchel and produced the third item, a roll of paper bound with a thin strip of leather. "There is only a map." She placed it in my hand and left without another word. I sat there holding a rolled piece of vellum paper while 19 girls stared at me. Darlene broke the silence first. "What does a map open?" I didn't have an answer. I turned the roll over in my hands. On the outside, in my grandfather's careful, slanted handwriting I recognized though I hadn't seen it since I was 8 years old, were 4 words: "For Nora. Find it. I want to tell you something before I go any further." My grandfather, August Voss, was not a cruel man. I know that now. I knew it then too. Somewhere underneath the anger, the way you know a thing you've buried but haven't killed. He was a surveyor and a geologist who had spent 40 years mapping the mountains of southern West Virginia with the precision of a man who believed the land deserved to be understood. He had 1 daughter, my mother, and when she died of fever 2 days after I was born, he became the only family I had. We lived together in a cabin above the hollow for 8 years, just the 2 of us, and he taught me everything he thought a person needed to know. He taught me to read topographical maps before I could read books. He taught me that limestone was once a seabed, that a mountain is just patience made visible, that water always finds its way. He taught me that questions were more valuable than answers, because answers ended things and questions kept them alive. What he didn't teach me was why he gave me up. When the county car came that January and he loaded my small suitcase, I had screamed at him. I'd said things a child shouldn't say, things I was ashamed of later. And he stood in the snow with his arms at his sides and let me say them. And then he said, quietly, "You'll understand someday, Nora. I promise you will." I had 9 years to decide he was wrong. Now I was sitting with a rolled map in my hands and a sealed letter and $160, and the promise was still out there, waiting to be kept. I left Millhaven 3 days after Mrs. Aldridge's visit. I was 17, not yet legally free of the institution, but Mr. Calloway, the lawyer, had filed the necessary paperwork to transfer guardianship of the property to me, and Mrs. Harkin, the director of Millhaven, seemed relieved to have me go. I was the kind of girl who filled the silence with inconvenient thoughts said out loud. I had been told several times that I asked too many questions. I took the Greyhound south to Somersville, then caught a ride with a postal carrier named Gerald who was headed up toward Carnifex Ferry. He dropped me where the main road forked, pointed up the left branch and said, "Golly Hollow's that way. Maybe 4 miles, maybe 5, depends on the mud." He wasn't exaggerating about the mud. October in those mountains is a serious negotiation between the land and the sky, and that year the sky was winning. I had my suitcase, real leather, a gift from one of the Millhaven church volunteers years ago, battered now but still sound, and my grandfather's satchel of documents, and I walked 4.5 miles up a road that was mostly wishful thinking. I had not opened the map yet. I'd told myself I was saving it, but the truth was I was afraid of it. Whatever it led to, it would be the last thing my grandfather had given me, and once I understood it, the conversation between us would be over. I was still afraid of that being over. The hollow opened up around a bend in the road like a held breath released. The creek ran silver down the center of it, lined with sycamores that had gone pale and ghostly for the season. The ridge walls rose on both sides, hardwood forest dense as wool, interrupted here and there by limestone outcroppings the color of old teeth. And there, at the far end of the hollow, stood my grandfather's cabin. It was not in ruins, which surprised me. I'd expected ruin. It was weathered, the porch boards soft in places, the window glass so old it had gone slightly wavy. But the structure was sound, the way things built by people who understood materials stay sound. A woodpile stood at the side of the cabin, 3 years old at least by the look of it, but still good. The garden beds along the south wall were overgrown, but the bones of them were there. The stone edging my grandfather had built by hand. He had not let it fall apart. That mattered. I sat on the porch steps and opened the letter first. "Dear Nora, I know you are angry. You have earned that anger. I will not ask you to put it down before you're ready. What I will ask is that you hear me, and that you go to the cave before you make any decisions about the land. The map will lead you there. You will know the landmarks, I made sure of that. Some of them I showed you when you were small enough that you may not remember, but I believe some things settle into the body even when the mind forgets them. The cave has been sealed. It cannot be opened with a key. It was never meant to be opened with a key. Your grandmother Elsa sealed it first, in 1923 when she finished her work inside it. She left it sealed because she believed the right person would come for it when the time was right, and that person would need to earn it through understanding, not through luck of possession. I have added to what she built. I have tended it when I could. I have kept the records. What is inside that cave, Nora, is not treasure, but it is worth more than treasure. It is knowledge. 40 years of your grandmother's and 20 years of mine, and it belongs to someone willing to use it. I gave you up because I was dying and I was afraid, and because what I knew made me dangerous to be near. I will explain that in the second letter, which is inside the cave. There is always a second letter. Your grandmother taught me that. I am sorry, Nora. I am more sorry than this page can hold. Come find what we left you. August. I sat with that letter for a long time. The creek made its noise. A pair of crows argued somewhere in the sycamores. The mountains held their old, indifferent silence, and I sat in the middle of it with a piece of paper that had rearranged everything I thought I knew about the last 9 years. He was dying. He had been dying when he brought me to Millhaven, and he hadn't told me, and he hadn't trusted the county to tell me either. And for 9 years I had carried an anger that was built on a story that wasn't complete. I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you this because understanding is a process, not an event. I had not forgiven him yet. I had received new information that changed the shape of my grief. But grief doesn't dissolve on receipt of an explanation. It just takes a different form. I was sad now, where before I had been angry. That was something. It was not everything. I went inside, built a fire with the wood from the pile, still good, as I'd hoped, and ate the food I'd brought from Somersville. Then I opened the map. It was drawn on geological survey paper, the kind my grandfather used professionally, with the careful contour lines and elevation markers that had been the language of his work. The hollow was laid out in precise detail. Every landmark was labeled in his careful hand, but not with the names of things, with memories. The sycamore where you found the painted turtle, June 1952. That was at the creek bend. I remembered it suddenly and completely. The turtle's orange-streaked chin, my grandfather crouching beside me and explaining that turtles had been on Earth for 200 million years and had no plans to leave. The shelf rock you called the Elephant's Back, high up the western ridge. I had named it that at age 5 because of the wrinkled gray limestone, and he had written it in his survey notebook right then and called it official. The place where your grandmother's rosemary planted itself, 1924. Along the south-facing slope, a patch of silver green I could see from the cabin window even now, gone wild and enormous, 3 feet high and spreading. And at the far end of the hollow, where the limestone ridge curved back on itself and formed a kind of natural alcove, barely visible through the hemlock, the place she called her thinking room, an X in red ink, the only color on the entire map. Find it the way she found it, by touch. I went the next morning, before the fog had lifted. This felt right. The letter had said I would know the landmarks, and I did, which meant my grandfather had understood that the body holds what the mind releases. I knew the path through the hollow without needing to think about it. My feet knew the creek crossing, knew to angle left at the second shelf of rock, knew to duck under the hemlock boughs at the ridge curve. The alcove was maybe 40 feet across, a natural curve of limestone that formed a shallow recess in the ridge face. The rock here was different from the rest of the hollow wall, older looking, with a fine-grained texture and a slight iridescence in the morning light, as if something was growing inside the stone itself, which, I would learn later, was essentially true. Limestone is calcium carbonate, ancient seashells compacted by time, and it is not inert. It breathes, in its way. It interacts with water and air and the slow chemistry of the world. The face of the alcove was covered in decades of moss and lichen and the tendrils of wild grape that had sent exploratory runners along every horizontal surface. I began at the left edge and worked right, the way my grandfather had taught me to read a survey, systematically, with intention. Find it by touch. My hands told me what my eyes couldn't. The moss was thick and undifferentiated along most of the face, but about 12 feet in from the left edge, I felt it, a seam, vertical, running from the ground to about 7 feet up, too straight for natural fracture, and then crossing it horizontally at about waist height and again at about knee height, 2 more seams. A door framed in stone, invisible under 40 years of growth. There was no keyhole, no handle, just the seams. I pressed against the face and it didn't move, but I hadn't expected it to, not with direct pressure. My grandfather had said it couldn't be opened with a key. He had said it needed to be earned through understanding. I stood back and thought, a geologist would seal a cave with an understanding of the rock, and a woman who had spent years studying limestone would know that limestone is not static. It shifts with temperature and moisture. It expands and contracts with the seasons. A door cut from living rock would need to account for that movement, would need a mechanism that worked with the material rather than against it. I thought about my grandfather's voice. Water always finds its way. I looked up. Above the door, where the natural overhang of the alcove kept the rock face dry in all but the worst rains, there was a narrow, horizontal crack, not a seam, a natural fissure, the kind that forms when limestone layers separate by a hair's width, directly above the left edge of the door. I put my fingers in it. There was a wooden wedge inside, old and dry, fitted perfectly into the fissure, a shim. I worked it out slowly, careful not to break it, and when it came free, I heard a soft sound, not mechanical, more like a held breath released, and the stone door shifted forward by perhaps half an inch, breaking the seal of decades. I pressed my palms flat against the face and pushed, and the door swung inward on a hidden pivot of iron, slow and deliberate, like something that had been waiting to be asked. The air that came out was cold and dry and smelled of mineral earth and, underneath it, like a memory, rosemary. I stood in the entrance for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust. The cave's main chamber was larger than the outside suggested, roughly 50 feet deep and perhaps 25 feet wide, with a ceiling that peaked at about 12 feet in the center. The floor had been leveled with flagstone, carefully laid, sealed with a pale mortar that had held for decades. Along the walls, stone shelves had been built into the natural ledges, fitted and mortared like the floor, but it was the ceiling that stopped my breath. My grandmother had installed a system of mirrors along the upper portion of the walls and across the ceiling, not the small household mirrors I'd expected, but large polished sheets of reflective metal, some copper, some what appeared to be a tin alloy, all angled with precise calculation toward a single source, a natural chimney in the cave ceiling, perhaps 8 inches across, that opened to the sky above the ridge. During the hours when sunlight entered that chimney at the right angle, the mirrors caught it and distributed it through the chamber in a pattern of overlapping reflected light, soft, diffused, without the harshness of direct sun, more like the light inside a tent on a bright day than anything underground. The light reached all the way to the back wall, not brilliantly, not enough for summer crops, but enough to grow things. The raised stone beds along the floor were empty now. Whatever my grandmother and grandfather had last grown had long since finished, but the beds themselves were intact, their soil still dark and alive-smelling, the limestone water channels that ran between them still clear, still carrying the slow seep of groundwater from the ridge. On the back wall, there was a shelf unit built of chestnut wood, old and darkened with age. On it, glass jars of seeds, labeled in 2 different handwritings, one older and more ornate, one I recognized as my grandfather's, field notebooks, a leather journal, thick as a Bible, and on the middle shelf, in a plain envelope with my name on it in my grandfather's hand, the second letter. I made myself look at everything else first. I told myself this was discipline, survey the room before you read the document. But I think what I was really doing was trying to stay inside the anticipation a little longer, the last moment before I knew everything I was going to know. The journals were remarkable. My grandmother Elsa Voss, born 1881, died 1935. A woman I had never met and never been told much about, had spent 12 years developing a system of underground cultivation based on her understanding of cave microclimate and limestone chemistry. She had discovered through patient trial and error that a sealed limestone cave in the central Appalachians maintains a nearly constant temperature year-round. In this hollow, approximately 54 degrees Fahrenheit, too cool for most summer crops, but warm enough that nothing froze, ever. She had also discovered what she called the limestone gift, the natural slow release of calcium and trace minerals from the cave walls into the seeping water, creating a dilute natural fertilizer that required no supplement. The key limitation was light, and she spent 8 years solving it, experimenting with different reflective materials and angles until she had developed the mirror system that lit the cave for 4 hours on a good winter day, 2 hours on the worst winter days, and up to 6 hours in summer. In those hours, with that light and that constant temperature and that mineral-rich water, she had grown food year-round. Greens, herbs, root vegetables, mushrooms in the back chamber which needed no light at all. Her journals documented everything. Which varieties thrived, which failed, at what seeding densities, with what spacing, harvesting cycles, preservation methods. She had been, in the vocabulary of her era, a self-taught agricultural scientist. She had been, in any vocabulary, a genius, and she had never told anyone. Not because she was ashamed. Her journals were not the journals of a woman ashamed. They were the journals of a woman who had learned through decades of being dismissed and ignored and occasionally laughed at, to protect what she valued by keeping it close until she found someone worthy of it. She had found my grandfather. He had continued her work for 26 years after her death. He had added 3 more growing beds, improved the mirror array, documented the varieties she hadn't tried, and compiled everything into a comprehensive manual for cave cultivation that he called, with characteristic practicality, the Hollow Book. It was on the shelf. 240 handwritten pages, cross-referenced, indexed, illustrated with diagrams so precise they could have been published in an agricultural journal, had been intended to be published, as I would learn. That intention was part of what had made him dangerous to certain people. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I sat down on the flagstone floor, cross-legged in the soft, diffused light of my grandmother's mirrors, and I opened the second letter. Nora, you found it. Of course you found it. You were always the one who would. Let me explain what I should have explained 9 years ago, when you were 8 years old and I was putting you in a county car and you were telling me every true thing a child can tell a person who is failing them. In 1952, the year before your mother died, the year before you were born, a company called Meridian Coal and Development began buying up hollow land throughout the Gauley River watershed. They paid fair prices at first, which made people trust them. Then the prices dropped, the pressure increased, and the people who refused to sell found other kinds of pressure applied. I refused to sell. Your grandmother's cave, her work, this land, none of it was for sale. What Meridian wanted the land for was not coal, despite the name. They had secured contracts with the federal government for the disposal of industrial chemical waste from several manufacturing facilities in the Ohio Valley. They intended to use the hollow land, its abandoned mine shafts, its natural caverns, its distance from population centers, as an unlined burial site for materials that had no business being buried in limestone country. Limestone, Nora. Porous, water-conducting, the very material your grandmother had spent her life understanding. The very material that would carry those chemicals into every watershed, every well, every creek in a 40-mile radius. I knew what they were planning. A geologist knows his ground. I tried to stop it through proper channels. The county, the state, 2 different federal agencies. I wrote letters that went unanswered. I filed complaints that were lost. I contacted a reporter in Charleston who was interested for 3 weeks and then was not. In 1953, my daughter, your mother, died of a fever that the doctor called unexplained. She was 22 years old and had never been sick a day in her life. The well water at the cabin tested clear, but I had been testing the hollow's water table for months by then, and what I found in the Lower Creek sampling sites was not clear. I cannot prove what I believe about your mother's death. I have never been able to prove it, but I believe it, Nora. I believe it in my bones and in the geology and in the fact that 3 other families in the Lower Hollow lost someone in the years between 1952 and 1955, and none of those losses were ever investigated. After your mother died, I raised you, and I continued my research. I documented everything: the water testing, the geological surveys, the chemical analysis I could manage with the equipment I had, the testimony of neighbors who had also noticed things going wrong. I was building a case, not a legal case. I was a geologist, not a lawyer, but a record, something that couldn't be ignored if it was complete enough. Meridian knew what I was doing. I began to receive visitors. Men in cars that didn't belong to anyone in the county. The kind of visits that are not quite threats, but are not quite not threats either. That was when I understood that you were not safe near me. I want to tell you that putting you at Millhaven was a sacrifice. It was. But I also want to tell you the truth, which is that it was also a cowardice. I was 58 years old and I was dying. My heart, as it turned out, though I didn't know then how much time I had, and I was afraid, and I told myself that protecting you and continuing the work were incompatible. Maybe they were. Maybe there was another way I didn't find. What I found instead was this. I finished the record. It is all here. Every water test, every geological survey, every statement I could collect, every document that was given to me or that I found discarded or that I was able to copy before it disappeared. It is a full accounting of what Meridian coal and development did to this hollow and to the people in it. It is also a full accounting of what your grandmother found here, in this cave, in this ground, and what I continued. Because the two things are connected, Nora. The hollow is poison and the hollow is medicine, both at once, and the same ground that they contaminated is the ground that fed us and can feed others again if someone knows how. The hollow book is on the shelf. The case files are in the cedar box on the bottom shelf, sealed with pitch. Take both. What you do with them is your choice. Entirely yours. I have no more advice to give you, except this. Your grandmother was told all her life that what she was doing was impossible. She grew food in the dark for 20 years before she told another living soul. She was right, and they were wrong. And the only person who can decide when to stop being quiet is the person who knows what they know. You know what you know, Nora. I love you. I have loved you since before you were born, when your mother put my hand on her side and I felt you kick. And you have never not been loved, even in the years when I could not be the one doing it. Come home. The cave is yours. August. I don't know how long I sat in that cave. Long enough for the light to shift and the mirrors to go dim, the brief autumn sun moving past the angle of the chimney. I sat in the near dark with the letter in my hands and the sound of the water channels running and the smell of mineral earth and old rosemary. Here is the thing about grief that no one tells you. It has texture. The grief of the girl who believed she was abandoned feels one way. Sharp, like something cut and left open. The grief of the girl who understands why feels different. Heavy, like something held for too long. Neither is worse. They're just different weights you carry differently. I had 9 years of the first kind. I was just beginning the second. But underneath both of them, I found something else, something that had been there all along, growing in the dark the way things do in that cave, patient and quiet and waiting for light. Purpose. I had grown up at Millhaven being told that I was difficult, that I asked too many questions, that I should learn to be practical and grateful and quiet. I had a mind that cataloged and connected and pushed against the edges of what I was permitted to know. And every institution I'd lived in had treated that mind as a problem to be managed. My grandmother had had the same mind. She had spent 40 years using it in secret, in a cave in a hollow. Because the world she lived in had no room for what she was building. My grandfather had had the same mind. He had spent the last years of his life using it to try to hold accountable the people who had poisoned the ground beneath everything she'd built. And now I was here, 17 years old, with the record and the knowledge and the cave and the hollow and $160. And the question wasn't whether I was capable. The question was what I was going to do first. I did both things at once, which is something I do not recommend if you have a choice. When you don't have a choice, it's the only way. I reopened the cave garden that first winter, following my grandmother's journals the way you follow a map, which is to say with absolute faith in the person who drew it and constant reference back to what you're actually seeing in front of you. The mirrors needed cleaning. One of the copper sheets had developed a patina that cut its reflectivity by half, and I spent 3 days with vinegar and salt restoring it to something useful. The water channels needed clearing. 2 of the growing beds had developed a calcium crust on the soil surface that I broke up and worked in, following my grandmother's note that the crust is not enemy, it is concentration. Work it back. I planted cold-tolerant varieties first. Spinach, kale, a small-leafed lettuce variety my grandmother called her winter green and had saved seeds for across 30 years. The seeds germinated in 8 days. In 6 weeks I had my first harvest, pale green, crisp, impossibly alive in that dark chamber, and I stood in the middle of the cave holding a colander of spinach I had grown underground in December in the mountains of West Virginia, and I laughed out loud by myself in a cave. I laughed until I was crying, and then I just cried, and I think I was crying for everything that cave had ever held and grown in the dark. At the same time, I was learning what my grandfather had collected. The cedar box held 4 years of meticulous documentation. Water samples taken monthly from 6 points in the Hollow Creek and the 3 feeder streams, each tested with simple chemical reagents my grandfather had ordered through a university supply catalog. Geological surveys showing the permeability of the limestone formation and the likely path of groundwater through it. A series of hand-drawn maps overlaying the meridian land acquisitions with the locations of families who had experienced illness, livestock death, and crop failure. A folder of documents, some original, some copies, that included an internal meridian memorandum from 1951 describing the hollow land as suitable for waste disposition due to remoteness and low property valuations, and noting in a sentence that my grandfather had underlined in red that limestone permeability presents long-term migration risk but monitoring costs will be managed. They knew. They had known from the beginning, and they had weighed the monitoring costs against the disposal costs and chosen to let the ground carry the poison wherever the water took it. I was not a lawyer. I was a 17-year-old girl with a 9th-grade education from Millhaven and a suitcase full of my grandfather's documents and a cave full of growing greens. I was not, by any reasonable measure, a threat to a coal and development company with federal contracts and lawyers on retainer. But I had learned to grow food in the dark. I had learned from 2 people who had done impossible things with patience and knowledge and the refusal to accept that the conditions made it impossible. And I had learned that the most dangerous person is not the one with the most resources, it's the one who keeps going when everyone else has stopped. I wrote 3 letters that January. The first to Mr. Calloway, the lawyer in Dunbar, enclosing a summary of my grandfather's findings and asking whether he knew of any legal mechanism for pursuing what I believed amounted to contamination liability. He wrote back that he was not an environmental attorney. There was barely such a thing in 1962, but that he knew a man in Charleston who handled claims against coal companies and might know what to do. The second letter I wrote to the Agricultural Extension Office at West Virginia University, enclosing a description of my grandmother's cave cultivation system and asking if anyone there had encountered similar work. The response I received 6 weeks later was from a professor of soil science named Dr. Harriet Beam, who said she had never encountered anything like it, asked if she could visit, and included a paper she had written on subterranean microclimate agriculture that cited 2 European cases but nothing from Appalachia. She said the hollow could be significant. She said the word significant 3 times in 2 paragraphs. The third letter I wrote to the families in the lower hollow. I had found their names in my grandfather's notes. I introduced myself as August Voss's granddaughter and asked if they would be willing to talk. 3 of them wrote back within a month. One of them, a woman named Clara Higgins, whose husband had died in 1954 of what the doctor had called system failure, cause undetermined, drove up the hollow road on a February afternoon in a truck held together by prayer and drove over 3 of the boards I had not yet replaced on the porch and walked into my cabin and sat down at my kitchen table and said, "Your grandfather tried to warn us. We didn't listen because he was just one old man talking about water. How many people do you have now?" "Just me," I said. "Well," she said, I suppose that's a start. It took 4 years. I want to say that simply and not dress it up, because the people who make things sound easy are the people who want you to feel bad for finding them hard. 4 years of growing food in the cave through the winters and selling it in Somersville and using that money to pay for water testing and legal fees. 4 years of Dr. Beam making quarterly visits, documenting the cave system, writing it into her research, getting it into the academic literature where it could not be ignored. 4 years of Clara Higgins and her network of Lower Hollow families, 10 of them by the end, then 14, adding their testimony to the record my grandfather had started. The Charleston attorney, a man named Theodore Greer, who was lean and serious and did not sleep enough, took the case pro bono because he said it was exactly the kind of case that needed to be taken. He filed in federal court in 1963. Meridian's lawyers filed to dismiss 17 times. 17. Theodore counted them with the grim satisfaction of a man who considers persistence a form of combat. In 1965, a federal judge denied the 18th motion to dismiss and ordered the case to trial. Meridian settled 6 weeks before the trial date. The settlement required a complete remediation of the contaminated groundwater sites, a process that took 8 years and was monitored by a federal oversight committee. It established a fund for the families who had suffered documented health losses. It included, at my specific insistence, a public acknowledgement of the contamination and its source. They did not admit responsibility for my mother's death. There was not enough direct evidence, Theodore said, and I had known from the beginning there wouldn't be. Some wrongs cannot be fully accounted for, only partially. You take what accounting is possible and you keep the rest in your chest, in the place where the old grief lives, the one that never entirely resolves. But the hollow was clean again, or beginning to be, and the cave was full. Dr. Beam published her study of the Voss Hollow cultivation system in 1964 in a journal that I could not have named at the time but which apparently mattered considerably in agricultural science circles. The paper was called Subterranean Microclimate Agriculture in Limestone Cave Systems, a case study from the Appalachian Highlands, and it credited Elsa Voss, August Voss, and Nora Voss, 3 generations of people the world had not been listening to. In print, in a journal, irrevocable. I received letters from 7 different universities over the following year. I received a visit from a man representing the Department of Agriculture who wanted to know if the system could be scaled. I received, somewhat to my astonishment, an offer of a fellowship at WVU, created specifically for non-traditional students in agricultural science, for which Dr. Beam had quietly advocated on my behalf. I was 21 years old and I had never finished high school, and I had been told since I was 9 that I asked too many questions, and now a university was offering me a place because of the questions I had asked. I went. I commuted when I could and came back to the hollow on weekends and breaks and every chance I had. I could not leave the cave for long. I don't mean that as sentiment, I mean it practically. Someone had to tend the mirrors and the water channels and the growing beds. Clara Higgins learned the system and tended it when I was gone, and she was better at the mushroom cultivation than I had ever been, and she said it was the most interesting thing she'd done in 60 years of living in the hollow, and I believed her. I graduated in 1969. I was 25. I was the first person in my family to earn a university degree, which is a sentence that sounds more triumphant than it felt, because triumph is a public thing and this was deeply private. It was between me and 2 dead people and a limestone cave that had kept their work alive until I could carry it forward. I carried it forward. The Voss Hollow Teaching Farm was established in 1972 using the settlement funds, the university partnership, and a federal grant that Theodore Greer helped us write. It trained farmers in subterranean cultivation techniques, cave growing, mine shaft adaptation, slope terrace systems, focusing on Appalachian communities where arable land was limited and food security through the winter months was a constant and difficult problem. Over the following 20 years, more than 400 people came through the program. They left knowing how to grow food in places where food wasn't supposed to grow. They left with copies of the Hollow Book, my grandfather's manual, which I had expanded and published through the university press, crediting Elsa Voss as the primary author. They left understanding that the conditions don't have to be perfect, that the light doesn't have to be brilliant, that what looks like darkness is often just a place that hasn't been tended yet. I am 73 years old now. I still live in the Hollow, in the cabin my grandfather built and that I have repaired and expanded over the decades until it is truly mine. The bones of it his, the rooms of it mine. The garden along the south wall, half his varieties and half things I've found and saved myself. I go into the cave every morning. That has not changed in 56 years. The mirrors are cleaner now. We replaced the copper sheets in the 1980s with aluminum composite, a refinement my grandmother would have appreciated, and the growing beds are tended by the students in residence. But I go in every morning, and I walk the length of the chamber in the soft reflected light, and I check the water channels and the soil and the seedlings, and I think about Elsa Voss in 1923 working alone in the dark, learning by failure and trying again. She never got credit in her lifetime. She never stood in a university hall and heard her name spoken with respect. She grew food in a cave in a hollow in West Virginia for 12 years and sealed it and left a letter for whoever came next. And whoever came next was my grandfather, and whoever came next after that was me, and whoever comes next after me is already here. 6 young people in the resident program right now who are asking better questions than I was asking at their age, which is the best thing I can think of to say about the future. The map is framed now and hanging on the cabin wall, under glass. My grandfather's handwriting, those careful red ink landmarks, the X at the cave entrance where he wrote, the place she called her thinking room. He was right, I realized years later, about what he meant. It was not the cave that was the thinking room. It was the hollow itself, the whole 12 acres of it, the creek and the ridge walls and the rosemary gone wild on the south slope, and the limestone that my grandmother understood as intimately as other people understand the faces of those they love. The hollow was the place where 3 people, across 3 generations, did their thinking and their building and their refusing to stop. It is my thinking room still. I want to tell you one more thing, and then I'll let you go. The day the federal settlement was announced, Clara Higgins drove up the hollow in her truck. A different truck by then, not held together by prayer, though prayer was still involved, and brought a bottle of good bourbon and 2 glasses, and we sat on my porch in the October afternoon and watched the light move down the ridge walls, and she said, "Your grandfather would have liked today." "I think so," I said. "He'd have been insufferable about it," she said. And I laughed, because that was true too. He had been a man who was certain he was right, and he had been right, and the combination had made him difficult to be around when he was alive. "He left me a map instead of a key," I said. "I've thought about that a lot. Why a map?" "Because a key opens one thing," Clara said. "A map shows you the terrain." She was right. A key is a single answer. A map is 100 questions, and the questions are the point. The questions are what make you understand the land well enough to move through it, to find what's there, to know what you're looking at when you arrive. My grandfather didn't leave me a shortcut. He left me a way of seeing. My grandmother didn't leave a door that could be unlocked from outside. She left a door that opened when you understood how the stone moved. What they gave me, both of them, was not the answers. It was the capacity to find the answers myself, and the knowledge that someone before me had done it, which is sometimes the only thing you need to begin. I don't know what sealed door you've been standing in front of. I don't know what someone told you about who you are and what you're capable of and what you deserve from this world. But I know what a map means. A map means the person who drew this believed you were capable of reading it. A map means there is something worth finding. A map means you don't need a key, you need understanding. and understanding is a thing you build by going toward it. Your hollow is waiting. Your cave is there, behind the moss and the decades and the things you've been told about yourself. Go find it by touch. If this story moved something in you, if you've stood outside your own sealed door, or if you've inherited something that looked like nothing until you understood what it actually was, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. These stories are only worth telling because of the people who receive them. Subscribe if you believe that what grows in the dark is worth tending. The next story is already waiting.